tonight. Okay, we're going to do that in a minute. Tonight, what are we going to be talking about? Okay, take a look at tonight's class objectives. This is your sheet. I'm sorry, last week I was in zombie land. Where is everybody? 2, 4, 6, 8. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. Oh, I guess that's right. Okay. All right. Anyway, I'm unjet lagged for the most part, and getting back into getting on top of stuff. So, the class objectives tonight. First of all, we're going to try to introduce the whole global challenge with about a half-an-hour video talking about the global urban and migration challenge. We're going to talk about how God has called us to minister to the nations, and now in a complete change, and that's why we call it Mission Shift, the world has come to us in ways that are so absolutely outrageous. I don't think 20 years ago that 0.5% of Americans could have found Afghanistan on a map. We're probably up to 10% now. But as far as what Afghanistan was, or have you ever heard it, or places like Somalia, you know, there were no Somalis in the Twin Cities before but late 1980s. Just unheard of. But okay, we're going to begin to learn about the concept of culture, and we really want to introduce this. And for some of you, you've learned some stuff about culture. But this piece of learning what it is and learning how to learn a culture, because you learn what makes up a culture, is going to be critically important for you the rest of your life, in your job, probably in your own family, in your neighborhood, and certainly if you're doing ministry. Okay? And finally, we're going to begin to learn about how to learn a culture. And that's an important thing, is that, as I've said before, I've seen hundreds of people come into this neighborhood and fail because they thought they knew how to do ministry, and they thought that they could just come down here and do ministry to everybody, and everybody would come to their church, and they kept running their faces into brick walls, and they couldn't figure out why they were so spectacularly unsuccessful. So that's the kind of thing we're going to be tackling tonight. Okay, that's tonight, and this is one of the two of the main areas. Session 1 or Unit 1 and 2 are wrapped around each other, and so we're going to be kind of introducing both tonight. All right. Any questions as we begin? Okay, let's have devos. Come on up, and you can use the microphone. It's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, cool. So here's the deal. I was supposed to get that book today in the mail, and the mail didn't come today, so I don't have devos that have anything to do with the book. But I do have devos, and they might not be 2-3 minutes long. But I'm going to read from Colossians 3:12 through 15, probably, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, Colossians 3:12. That's where we're going to start. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you are called to peace, and be thankful. I'll read through 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, and as you sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. Actually, I'm going to read through 17. And whatever you do, whatever in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And actually, I chose these verses 15 minutes ago, approximately. I put it off all week and all day, and God really placed this on my heart to share with you 15 minutes ago, these verses, because this is what missions is about. It's about loving and clothing yourselves with this, but we can't do it on our own. We have to have Christ, and without Christ, we have nothing to share with people. So yeah, that's what I got. Hopefully this is encouraging, and that's it. you want me to pray or no? Okay. God, thank you for tonight, and I thank you. I thank you for the grace that you have given us freely, that we can't understand. I thank you for this class and how we get to learn together how to better serve your kingdom and your precious, eternal human being souls. I thank you for this opportunity, and I thank you for this day. I pray that you will speak through Roland tonight and help us to learn something. In your name, amen.
Okay, very good. Well, the center of what we do is Jesus. And helping people to get to know Jesus in a relationship with the living God through Jesus. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. The gospel is the power of God. Now, there's a lot of nice things you can do if you've got the wherewithal. I know all you students probably could stand out on the front steps giving away $20 bills all day. And people would probably be very happy to get them. Maybe to come back 2 or 3 times. But in the long run, I don't know that in most cases that would do a lot of good. It might for a short period of time. When it comes down to doing good, the Boy Scouts and the Unitarians can do good, and that's real good. You can help people clean up after a tornado or whatever, but none of those organizations have been created by God to bring people back in a relationship with him. So, yes, thank you. That's the center is the center is the center is the center. Okay. Now, I want to introduce our stuff with the video I didn't show you last week. Disc menu. And I want to show you the intro. That's the one we want, this one. No, actually we don't. Wait a minute. We want that one. Okay. The other one's the old one. This is a new one. They both star Brad Pitt. Took a lot of, as I said, it takes a lot of makeup to make him look that bad. Why is that not coming up? Or maybe even something called a newspaper. You notice that the world is changing very quickly. Is somebody back there? Chimani, are you in back? Can you turn the volume up on the computer, please? Put it up about 97. For some reason, these PC level, yeah. It's at 100. Morning when you wake up and read the news on your smartphone or on your laptop or maybe even something called a newspaper. There we go. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. Any given morning when you wake up and read the news on your smartphone or on your laptop or maybe even something called a newspaper, you notice that the world is changing very quickly. We're in the midst of a time of a huge global change that's going to have more of an impact on the world than the fall of the Roman Empire. It's going to have more of an impact on the world than the Black Death, which killed half the people in Europe. It's going to have more of an impact on the world than the coming of Europeans to the American continents. It's going to have more of an impact on the world than everything that came out of World War II, including the coming of the nuclear age. Now, what is it that could possibly change things so much, so drastically, so completely, and so universally across the entire world? Remember that 2000 movie with George Clooney? There was a tremendous storm that they happened to be caught in off the North Atlantic where conditions were just right. Three conditions came together to create this perfect storm. Well, we're in the midst of a perfect storm of change just like that, and that perfect storm is called globalization. The first aspect we're going to talk about is something called urbanization. The world is moving to cities. In 1800, there was one city in the world of 1 million people. It was a dickens of a city. What was it? You're right, it was London. But still, 97% of the world's people lived in rural areas, they lived in villages, they lived as wandering pastoralists. By 1900, because of the Industrial Revolution, that grew to being 10% of the world's people. After World War II, the graph went vertical, so that by the year 2000, 50% of the world's people lived in cities. At the current rate, the number of people living in cities will double every 38 years. And by the year 2025, 75% of the world's people will live in cities, vast metro areas of millions of people. And this is happening all over the globe. If we take a look today at the growth of megacities, megacities are defined by the UN as being over 10 million people. In 1950, there was one megacity, and that was New York. By the year 1985, there were now 9 megacities. By 2004, it was 19. 2009, it was 30. By 2015, it'll be 60. And 1/7 of the world's people living in these huge cities live in shanty towns. They live in cardboard houses and in very tenuous living situations. If we look at this map, we can see the growth of megacities just in our time. In 1950, we can see just the beginnings of these megacities. New York, we can see Buenos Aires, Tokyo. If we look then at the year 2000, we can see the growth of these cities all over the globe. See how they're springing up, particularly in East Asia. And the final map is 2015. 2015, we see the explosion of megacities all across East Asia. We see them beginning in Africa. And this is the trend that we will see continuing throughout the 21st century. As we study these cities, the thing that strikes us over and over again is that the challenges of the city are the same everywhere, whether it's Tokyo, or whether it's Quito, or whether it's Bogota, Colombia, or whether it's Minneapolis. The challenges of the city are the same. Young people from all over the globe move into cities. And these are single-generation families in that they don't have aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas and all the things that it takes to hold a young family together. It doesn't take a village to raise a child. It takes a marriage and a family to raise a child, but it takes a village to hold that marriage together. And young marriages all over the globe in these single-generation families fall apart. And what comes from that, these single-parent families, oftentimes it's accompanied by physical abuse, oftentimes it leads to prostitution, leads to HIV and AIDS. Then these same challenges that happen all over the globe of chemical dependency, mental illness, seem to be urban-related problems, to a much higher degree because of the stress of living in cities. And plus, as we go to every city in the world, we see the same challenges of educational needs, economic needs, development needs. Water and sewage is a huge problem all over the majority world. If you look at the nation of China, it's developing incredibly quickly. In the entire nation of China, only 2% of the sewage is treated. 98% of the sewage, including human waste, heavy metals, industrial waste, go directly into the rivers to the next town down where they try to make it into drinking water. Tremendous opportunity for Christians to do mission. Now, we can talk about the needs of a nation, we can talk about the needs of a city and 1 billion here and 1 million there, but it finally gets down to human faces and individual needs. These two little girls are in a picture taken by my son in Bogota, Colombia a few years ago. He was down there with YWAM with a bunch of kids, and they were serving in a mission. And that day those girls came in and they had a shower and they got their hair washed and they got barrettes had a little face painting, had some clean clothes on. But notice, look in their eyes. The little girl on the right is 4 years old. The girl on the left is her sister. She's 18 months old. These little girls are without parents. In South America, they call kids like this shoeshine boys. And they sleep in puppy piles. They have no parents. They support themselves however they can, maybe selling chiclets one day, maybe stealing something the next day. They often support themselves by prostitution. The day that they came into the mission, the little girl on the left, who was 18 months old, was being treated for gonorrhea. That's a tremendous human need. But worse yet, not only is there no care for them, but in some countries, particularly in Brazil, there's been a long history of these kids simply being taken out and being shot because they're a nuisance, they're stealing, they're spreading disease. We can talk about 1 billion here and 1 million there, but it finally comes down to individual faces, individual needs, and people just like you and me. Now, the model of everything that we do in our educational programs in MissionShift Institute and the Urban Cross Cultural College Consortium is this model of 3 interlocking circles. The first and central primary work of the church is the proclamation of the gospel. Telling people the story of Jesus, to bring people to faith. Faith comes from hearing. That is the central work of the church. The gospel is the power of God. But that doesn't happen within a vacuum. That happens within a framework of intense human need, particularly in the cities of the world. And it's best transmitted and the best care of people is done through intense relationships. These 3 circles, proclamation of the gospel, human need, and relationships, where those 3 come together, that central part is holistic ministry. That's the model of Jesus. That's the model of Paul. That's the model of Spener and Franca, and the model of Wesley, and the model of Hudson Taylor. When we could get all of those 3 right, we end up with intense ministry that makes a huge difference in people's lives and most effectively brings the gospel. Now, any of these 2 together is also a ministry model. If we just talk about proclamation and human need, but don't take the time to build the relationships, oftentimes that was the model of the old rescue missions, the missions down in Skid Row, soup, supper, soap, and sermon. And a lot of lives were very effectively touched, but if there isn't the deep relationship, it doesn't work as well. If we've got the proclamation of the gospel and good relationships, that's friendship evangelism, and we've learned a lot about that, and that's the most effective evangelism. If we're dealing with human need and relationships, that's effective social work. But if we have all of 3 of those, the proclamation of the gospel, if we have in the context of human needs and the building of relationships, that's how it works the best. If we take a look at the Yoido Full Gospel Church, Yonggi Cho's church in Seoul, Korea, built entirely by cell groups who looked for hurting people. They look for hurting people, they deal with their human needs, they tell the gospel, they build their relationships, and that very effectively built that congregation into a tightly integrated, very effective congregation of 800,000 members. Throughout the history of the Christian church, time after time again, when there's been a revival, it's because we recognize the interrelationship of those 3 parts: proclamation of the gospel, human need, and relationships. So we've talked about urbanization. There's a second part of this triple whammy, of this perfect storm of change, and that's called the largest human migration in human history. Now, there have been many migrations, mass migrations in the midst of human history. Every few hundred years, a wave of immigration would go across Europe, like the Celts, or the Germanic tribes, or the Slavs coming across a few hundred years apart. There were migrations of the Han Chinese in Asia, or the movement of Polynesians all the way from Madagascar to Hawaii. These migrations are very natural, but today we're in the midst of one where people from everywhere are going every place else. We were down in San Jose, Costa Rica a couple of years ago, and we were on a bus trip across the city. And I got a little bored and needing something to do. I happened to start counting Chinese restaurants. Well, I lost track, someplace over 60 on one little trip across downtown on simply one street. I was talking with a missionary from Kenya a while back, and he was telling me about all the groups of expats from other parts of the British Empire that have come and lived in Kenya. Pakistanis, Chinese, Indians, who are all part of the people who live now in Kenya. And Americans are every place on the globe as well, serving in business, serving in government, serving in missions, or simply going to live there because it's an interesting place to live. It's not only then from country to country, but another huge part of this movement, we've probably got 2 billion people in motion around the globe. This article in the Asia Times newspaper talks about China. In just one program alone is in the process of moving 420 million people off of the land and into cities because they have an overpopulation in the rural areas and they have a labor shortage. This is an amazing time. So people are in movement from everywhere to everywhere, and all these cities are huge multicultural areas. Now we're up here in the upper Midwest, and you wouldn't think of Minnesota as being a real immigration hotbed out here on the tundra. But just a little while ago, the University of Minnesota came out with a study, and right now Minnesota has 216 languages. We've known for years that we have over 100 languages in the neighborhood our congregation is in, but there are 216 languages being spoken by various people groups in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota has a long history of resettling refugees, and that has a lot to do with it. Let's look a little bit more then at immigration trends in the United States. Every year, about 1 million people enter the United States legally. That's about 1 every 31 seconds. And that's been true since the 1960s when the immigration law changed. These 1 million people come, they get jobs, they settle down, and they become wonderful members of the United States. Another 1 million people come to the United States illegally every year. They may overstay student visas or tourist visas, or they may come across the border illegally. The types of people, the nationalities of these people change every few years as to whatever the groups are, depending upon economic situations, wars, and so forth. But these people come across, and they come across without documents. Historically, these people have entered a gateway neighborhood. This would be an immigrant neighborhood, which typically has remained the same neighborhood for most of the last century. As they become more acculturated, they oftentimes will move from the core city to nicer neighborhoods. They will become homeowners and so forth. Today things are changing, however, so we've got people coming to any place there's a job. We have small towns in rural Minnesota where there are dozens of languages being spoken. Now we have a labor shortage in the United States. It's interesting, we live in an interesting pattern. If we start right after World War I, after World War I there was a little spike in births, and that lasted across the 1920s until the coming of the Great Depression in about 1929. From 1929 through World War II, the birth rate was very low. Right after World War II, then we had the baby boom, and we had a huge generation. The baby boom ran from 1945 to 1964. Then we get to 1964, and all of a sudden, after 20 years of growth, we had a much smaller group. The pill was invented, families got to be a lot smaller, but also that was at the time when the children who were born during the Depression and during World War II, that much smaller generation, were also having children, but it was a much smaller generation. That's Gen X. Then following Gen X, we get to the early 80s, and all of a sudden the baby boomers started having children. So the echo boom, or Gen Y, that's a very large, the millennials, it's a large generation. And that generation is now being followed by the children of Gen X, which is once again a very small generation, Gen Z. Now the interesting thing is, even though throughout the middle 20-teens, the immigration to the United States slowed down, we're heading to a point now as we move into the past 2015 and into 2020 where we're going to have two factors coming together. One is that the generation coming up, the Gen Z, is a very small cohort. It's a very small generation. And at the same time, we're going to be seeing a tremendous retirement of the baby boomers. So we're heading towards, as we move to the middle of the 20-teens and into 2020, we're going to see another wave. We have to see another wave of immigration simply because we don't have enough workers. And at the same time that that's happening, we have to understand the relationship between the immigrants, especially the undocumented immigrants, and Social Security. The federal government is not interested in shutting off illegal immigration. These immigrants are each paying into the Social Security Trust Fund, and these are funds that they'll never be able to take back out again. So the costs of the baby boomers, to some degree, there's a little offset happening because of all these people paying into Social Security. So if we have 12 million immigrants, which is probably very low, but 12 million illegal immigrants, and we multiply that times, say, $24,000 a year, which also probably seems low, and then we multiply that times the 15% that they and their employers are putting into it, that comes out to be $43 billion a year. And that's all money that they can never touch. So this is the unwritten immigrant tax, and that has made a huge difference in Social Security funds. So there's a great complexity dealing with how do we control our borders, how do we deal with America, how do we deal with the cost of education, and so on. This series is neither pro-immigration or anti-immigration. Immigration, migration is happening all over the globe. It's probably unstoppable. It's happening in every country of the world. It's happening in every city of the globe. And every country will have to deal with it. All over Europe, it's the same situation, but the same thing is true in Central and South America. So as we take a look at this, the bottom line for the church is that if we're to bring our new neighbors to Jesus, if we're going to build the church within these immigrant groups, now is the time. But the church really hasn't got it. A tiny fraction of the American church is equipped and is understanding and is able to read the times and read the challenges that we have ahead of us. As we deal with 75 to 100 million immigrants and their families in our midst. This is the greatest challenge for the American church in our time. And we can't just say welcome immigrants. Each group is going to need to be learned. Their culture is going to need to be learned. Their language is going to need to be learned. We're going to have to reach them as we reach into the first generation, thinking like missionaries. They're not necessarily going to come and knock on your church door. Most of them have no understanding of what Christianity is. And the American church right now is at a particularly weak time. Only 4% of 20-somethings attend church in any given week. This is a very challenging time. So we've talked about urbanization, and we've talked about this migration that's bringing these millions of people into our midst. But the third piece is also affecting our lives every day, and that's called the fluidity of capital, labor, and information. A few years ago, Friedman wrote the book, The World is Flat. And that book talked about, and many books since have talked about the fact that this is a very, very small globe, connected with instant communication all over the globe. Capital, labor, and information know no boundaries. We have instantaneous communication. How many times in the last year have you been talking to someone helping you on the telephone, and they're in Ireland, or they're in Mexico, or Indonesia, or the Philippines? If you've had x-rays in an emergency room in the evening in an American hospital, there's a real good chance that those x-rays were actually being read in India in real time by a radiologist on the other side of the globe. As this happens, displacement of workers and capital will become more and more rapid and more simple and more widespread. Workers are being moved from place to place. Jobs are changing. One example of this is the job of mold makers. These are master machinists, and it was a very stable job in America until recently. They hand carve the molds that are used to make any plastic object, whether it's a chapstick or whether it's your cell phone. And they have to be extremely talented, they have to understand these materials, and they have to do absolute precision work. But today, these mold makers' jobs, which were high-paid, high-skilled jobs, are being replaced or being outsourced to China, where we simply email the blueprints, and the blueprints are received in China, and that mold is finished in a third of the time because they're working 3 shifts. It's being done perfectly, and then it's being FedExed back here for a fraction of the price. We live in very interesting times. Today, every student, every American high school student, isn't just competing with the kids in their town. Every high school student is competing with that guy in China who's very happy to work for 20 cents an hour. This is a very, very different world. And we're going to be challenged with jobs appearing and disappearing because of technology, because of outsourcing, because of communication at a rate that is just unheard of. So as we look at these 3 pieces, urbanization, migration, and the fluidity of capital, labor, and information, those 3 things come together and create globalization. And globalization is going to be changing every aspect of your life, of your job, of your family, and it's going to happen throughout your lifetime, throughout the lifetimes of your grandchildren, and it's going to have a greater impact on anything in humanity, probably since the invention of fire.
Not long ago, if you wanted to be a cross-cultural witness, a missionary to someone of a culture different than your own, you needed one of these, a passport. The world is changing due to the forces of globalization, and one of the impacts of that is a human migration, the greatest in the history of the world. People from everywhere are moving to everywhere else, and this is having significant impact in the United States and in North America, an impact that's shaping our communities and impacting the mission and ministry of the Church of Jesus Christ. In a sense, it's the Great Commission in reverse. Jesus told us to go into all the world and make disciples of every people group. But through this great migration, the world is coming to us, to our own community. It is the Great Commission in reverse. Let me share with you some new information from the recent census that really impacts how these cultural changes are impacting our communities and the church. Did you know the U.S. is now the most multicultural nation on earth? There is a citizen with their roots in every single country that now lives in the United States. In fact, 2/3 of our growth over the last 20 years has come from immigrants and the children of immigrants. What's of particular interest is the growth of the Latino population in the United States. 43% of our population growth between 2000 and 2010 have been among Latinos. In some places, they are now the majority population in cities. And in fact, as a minority group, they are now the largest minority group in the United States, having surpassed African Americans. It's interesting to note when you look at Latino growth that now the United States is the 3rd largest Spanish-speaking nation in the world. Did you know that in 4 U.S. states, Hawaii, California, Texas, and New Mexico, and the District of Columbia, over 50% of the population are now racial and ethnic minorities? Did you know by 2050 there will be no cultural or racial majority? Over 50% of Americans will be multicultural. Did you know over 9 million people in the United States Census identified themselves as either multicultural or multiracial? This cultural shift is also having an impact on our public schools. According to the Migration Public Policy Institute, over 150 languages are spoken in our public school system. In 2011, over 50% of the students in our public schools were students of color. Did you know that over 1/3 of the students in our United States public schools speak a language other than English? In addition to these cultural changes, there's a religious impact in our community. The United States is now the most religiously diverse nation in the world. There are now more Muslims, Hindus, or Buddhists than there are Lutherans and Episcopalians in the United States. Did you know that Islam is now the fastest growing religion in the United States? So beyond all these statistics and numbers, here's the challenge for the church in the United States. We are now the most religiously and culturally diverse nation in the world, more diverse than at any time in our history. And what we need to do is begin to think like cross-cultural witnesses, to think and act like God's missionary people. We have to prepare our young men and women for cross-cultural witness. And this is a critical role of the church and the Christian university.
The Twin Cities has changed drastically in the last few years, politically, socially, culturally, economically, but most of all religiously, due to the new immigration in our city. In fact, our city has become glocal. Let me explain this word. Global plus local equals glocal. And so we think globally, but we act locally. In 2002, the Brookings Institute named the Twin Cities one of the top 10 gateway cities in America for new immigrants and refugees. The Phillips neighborhood in South Minneapolis is now the most diverse neighborhood in America, with over 130 different languages spoken just in that one neighborhood. The light rail system in the Twin Cities sells tickets in 4 languages. Luckily, one of them is English, but English, Spanish, Hmong, and Somali. There's another new word I want to teach you, a new Scrabble word called ethnoburb. The immigrants aren't all moving to Phillips neighborhood or Minneapolis or the urban areas. They're moving to the suburbs. And over half the immigrants in the Twin Cities live in the suburbs, and so we call the suburbs the ethnoburbs. The Twin Cities is now home to the largest Somali population in America, the largest Hmong population, the largest Oromo Ethiopian population, the largest Anuak Sudanese population, the largest Karen Burmese population, as well as the largest Liberian population in America. We also have the second largest Tibetan concentration in our city as well. Bloomington is home to the Mall of America, the largest mall in America. Southdale is the very first mall ever created. We're kind of a mall people here, but now we have Hispanic malls and Laotian malls and Hmong malls, and there's even a couple Somali malls, and one of them I nicknamed the Somal of America, and they sell camel and goat and yak and guinea pig and all your favorite foods at these new ethnic markets and stores. Nicollet Avenue is now known as Eat Street. There are 75 ethnic restaurants up and down Nicollet Avenue. 20 years ago, Eat Street was not Eat Street. It was actually not a good place, and there were only a few ethnic restaurants. Immigrants came in, they created jobs, they created stability, and now it's a trendy, cool place to go. And you can literally eat your way around the world. There's an apartment complex in Minneapolis located near Highway 94 near the University of Minnesota now called Vertical Africa. There's over 5,000 Muslims living in one apartment complex. These immigrant groups see the Twin Cities as a mission field, and we need to see it as a mission field as well. In fact, they're going to build the largest mosque in America in Minneapolis. It's going to cost $48 million. So this new mega mosque will attract Muslims from all over the country. And they're trying to reach America from our city. In our city, several churches have now become Hindu temples, Sikh temple, Buddhist temples, and Muslim mosques. Immigration is not just an urban issue. For example, the largest Hindu temple in North America is in Maple Grove, a suburb of the Twin Cities. It's a $20 million temple on 20 acres of land, and they have 21 mini temples within it. Hampton, a suburb in the South Twin Cities, is home to the largest Cambodian Buddhist temple in America. Again, they see our city as a mission field. I live in Burnsville. Burnsville has become an ethnoburb, like I described before. 50% of the kids in the Burnsville school district are now non-white. My next door neighbor's from Cambodia. My other neighbor's from Belize. My other neighbor across the street's from Germany. My wife's Indonesian. There are also Russian stores in my neighborhood. There are 2 mosques in my neighborhood, 2 halal markets located within 1 mile of my house, Hispanic stores, Brazilian. Again, my neighborhood in the suburbs is an ethnoburb. The Twin Cities is not the only place where these drastic local changes are happening. All across America, big cities, small cities, we see this happening all over, and the demographics are changing everything. LA is the second largest Mexican, Samoan, Filipino, Salvadorian, and Korean city in the world. And they also have 800,000 Iranians living in LA. Miami is known as Little Havana with the second largest Cuban population in the world, and it also has the second largest Haitian population. Detroit is the largest Muslim city in America with the largest Iraqi population, the largest Yemeni population, and the largest Arab population of any city in America. St. Louis, Missouri has the largest Bosnian population. The San Francisco Bay Area of California has over 300,000 Chinese living there. The city of Houston, Texas is 36% Hispanic. San Jose, California has the largest Vietnamese population. It's known as Little Saigon. In the greater Bay Area, there are over 130,000 Vietnamese people living there. Now, these ethnic changes aren't happening just in large cities. They're happening in smaller cities as well. Barron, Wisconsin, a little town of 3,300 people, has 600 Somalis living there as well as 300 Hispanics. This is the new face of our country and our city. And these people are our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, and our classmates. And we need to reach them for Jesus Christ. 90% of them don't know Jesus. They might know a little bit about Jesus, but they've never met true Christians. And so this is our chance to be missionaries wherever we live in this new global world. I'm not a prophet, so don't stone me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the mission field has shifted in the 21st century right here across the cities of America. And I believe that what happens in the next 5 to 10 years in the cities of America will influence the entire world, good or bad. So there's a window for the church to do something great for God. And I believe this is the greatest time in history that missionaries have dreamed about, where the world is literally coming to our doorstep, and we can all be cross-cultural witnesses.
This movement of people is not by accident. It is orchestrated by God to reach
Now, I hope you wrote down every factoid there, right? If you want to share that with, suppose I should be using the microphone, huh? Throw the sheet of paper on the floor. Test 1, 2, 3. If you want to share that particular video with your friends, family, people on the street, whatever, you can go to the MissionShift website, and up in the upper right-hand corner, once you get into the website, there's an intro page, and then the upper right-hand corner has a couple of videos that we've made, and those can be useful. And this one is the one with Brad, is in that one. So, okay, now what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to break into first groups of twos. We've got to have one, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 7, 2, 4, 2, 5, 12. Okay, break into twos, and what I'd like you to do would be, I'd like you to each of you share 3 things that surprised you or you found interesting or amazing or you'd like to challenge or whatever. Take your schedule for tonight. That's this guy with the box on the top. And use that right on the back of it. And I'd like you to take 5 minutes and just write down with your partner. Find a partner on your mark, get set, go, and we're going to take 5 minutes. Let's take about 10 minutes. And just talk amongst yourselves with your partner person. How are you this evening? Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Test 1, test, test. Okay, let's all turn around back to the front, if you would, please. All right, let's share some of the things that your groups came up with. We need a spokesperson for each of your groups. You guys can volunteer for that. Someone volunteer. Okay, tell me about your group. Oh, let's flip you the mic.
We mentioned the vast established organized religions other than Christianity, like the huge campus up in Maple Grove of the Hindu temple, and then there's a large temple in Hampton, the video mentioned, and so just kind of the large established religious outreach, especially the vast $48 million mosque that's being built, or is, I don't know how recent this video was, but is here now, or I'm not sure. Okay. And then we talked about the term ethnoburb and how that's just kind of surprising as far as you think of like like sanctuary city or a refugee gateway city, but then like they're coming to the 7-county area, kind of, you know, the Twin Cities. Oh, okay. Yep. And I work in Burnsville, so the things that the video mentioned I resonated with. And then we just never really thought of Twin Cities as a gateway city, even though we had cultural diversity and all sorts of different immigrants. We just think of that as like maybe Chicago if it's in the Midwest, but otherwise like New York, LA.
When it comes down to refugees, we per capita have 4 times more UN refugees than any other metro area in the United States. 4 times. In raw numbers, we are number 3 after LA.
That's all we had, so I can give you the mic back.
Just forget it.
Okay.
LA or
Okay.
any others? Any more type of things?
That was the main things we talked about.
Okay, good. Who's the next person?
Yeah, we were just kind of surprised by the amount of globalization in Minneapolis. It was kind of new to me. I knew there was some kind of ethnic growth, but I didn't know it was this extent. And ethnoburbs, I'd really never heard of that before. That's kind of like a new idea to me. That's pretty much all I had.
No, I just was going to grab the mic so I can hand it to Derek, but...
We had a couple things that we thought. One of them is this idea, when we look into the eyes of another person, you're looking into something that's been created by God to live forever, whether with him or without him. May that be our heart, why we do this. And I'm speaking in general for all missions, and because it's really easy. You know, we get, at the church, we want to do missions, and what's the point? The point is that they matter to the Lord, that they're a creation of God. And that's something that God has really used in my life. A new perspective to think, this matters to God, whether it matters to me truly. This matters to God. God, how can this matter to me? And so I just thought that was really important, something that we can chew on. It's really helped me when I come up to someone I've never met, or maybe I'm scared, or they're a different religion, or they want to believe something other than God. It's been beneficial to think, wow, that's a person made in the image of God and his likeness. Yeah.
We were surprised by the number of languages being spoken in the Phillips neighborhood, but in the whole state of Minnesota. And then you'll have to clarify for this. For me, I heard that in the mega cities, the cities over 10 million, that a large portion were living in shanty towns, the population? Or was it?
In some of them, especially in Africa.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's a large shanty town related, I believe, to every megacity. Basically.
Yeah, which indicates poverty and all of those problems there. And here's some more insights.
We also discussed the ethnoburb concept, and also the even in terms of the labor shortage, And I mean, just in terms of a motivating factor for the nation and immigration, and then some of even the complexity related to Social Security was pretty surprising. Yeah.
One of the things that I'd learned, thank you very much, or kind of hit upon or whatever, between the first video series we did 10 years before this, was this whole thing of the waves of American population and the impact that that's had on the whole immigration thing. Okay, just going back to John Mayer, according to John Mayer, there's 1 million immigrants and their families in the Twin Cities now. 1 million. That's just phenomenal. But to see that the World War II generation, who were born right after World War I, that was a big generation. And then came the parents of Gen X, which was the small generation born during the Depression, born during World War II, and it's a remarkably smaller population. Then you've got the big baby boom. I'm right in the middle of it. And then you've got this small group of Gen X that came after us, and that's a small generation. And then my kids are part of the millennials. And so just to prove this, I don't know if I shared this earlier, but if I did, it's a review. When our oldest son was born in Mankato in 1981, in the Mankato Sears, there was one shelf of boy baby clothes, one rack of boy baby clothes. By the time our second son was born in 1983, the same store had 3 racks of boy baby clothes. Now that might not seem a lot, but that's exactly when the change happened. The baby boomers started having babies right around 1980. So my son, in fact, my older son said, "I'm not a millennial. I'm the last of the Xers." He doesn't want to be pigeonholed as a millennial, but he's right on that cusp. What does this mean? Well, for one thing, every time we get a big generation, like the World War II generation, or the Vietnam generation, or the millennials, it kind of looks to me like our foreign policy gets a little more aggressive, because we've got more young men and young women we can throw into wars. That kind of scares me, especially with 5 grandchildren coming through. But if you look at the timing, at least in this century. But when Gen X hit the labor force at the beginning of, or let's see, at the end of the 1980s, that's when Gen X hit the labor force. That was at the peak of the World War II generation's retirement. And that was the first trigger for immigration. Small generation coming in, big generation going out. Because they may be timed every 20, 25 years, but unfortunately when they come into the labor force, it's off. They're in the opposite points. So now we have this smaller Gen Z coming into the labor force. Those of you who are in college now are going to have a target-rich environment, because there's going to be lots of holes to fill of all these baby boomers who are leaving the teaching jobs, for example. Teaching jobs were so tight you couldn't buy a teaching job in the Twin Cities 10 years ago. Now they're going to be really, really short, and so forth and so on. We've got a tremendous shortage now of labor coming in, and okay, again, this class is neither pro nor anti-immigration. By design, we treat immigration as something that's just happening all over the globe. I'm not saying we should have it or shouldn't have it, but the bottom line, what draws it is, remember, there's a push and there's a pull. And the pull are human needs. The push are the human needs of what's going on in the other countries: wars, famines, violence, poverty. And the pull on our end is having jobs that nobody wants to take. Last year, my son, who was a construction manager, they all of a sudden, with the hurricanes hitting down on the Gulf Coast, They went from paying $35 a square, that's 10 by 10 feet, having roof shingles put on, $35 they were paying for labor for 1 square of roof shingles, to $150 and finally to $175 per square to get the roofs done because there wasn't enough labor. Now, part of it is because of, you know, a lot of that, the roofing has kind of pretty much been taken care of by Latinos, mostly Mexicanos. And the Mexicanos, some were leaving and some went down where, you know, they had a winter with warm weather to do work down there. I don't blame it. You blame them? And, but there's a big shift. Now, I don't want to speak anti or pro-Trump, and I'm trying to stay apolitical. I'm really personally torn over some of this stuff, but I'm trying to share this with you so that it doesn't shade it one way or the other. But the bottom line is that every time that there has been an amnesty for immigrants, instead of shutting the immigration flow off, it created more of a flow. And saying, well, it'll happen again. So, you know, and so that hasn't changed the flow thing at all because the borders have not been, you know, they're difficult, but they're not closed by any means. Now, do I feel badly for people that want to come here and work? People are in poverty? Yeah, I speak Spanish. I've spent 55 years of my life learning how to speak Spanish and learning the cultures and so on. But we also, every country has to have borders, and certainly Mexico protects its borders, and work permits are, you know, very tightly controlled and so on. These are questions of statecraft. But the bottom line is, I think Trump is playing two pieces here. One is he's playing off the far-right anti-immigration sentiment, especially in the Rust Belt states. No, Sun Belt states, where the states have to pay for medical and education and other costs, welfare sorts of costs. Not welfare itself, but the human services kind of costs. And they're very conservative with their money in Arizona, New Mexico, even the way that money is handled in California. So there's been a resentment there, and that's fueling. That doesn't exist up here. Maybe with some people, but I don't see that. But there are people who are very anti-immigrant. You know, there's one part of the Republican Party that's to keep America for Americans, and that's, you know, that pushes up against some real icky racist stuff that I'm really not comfortable with. On the other side of the Republican Party is the sentiment: are you nuts? This is our only chance to compete with China. I've said that last week. One side of the Democratic Party says, let's be compassionate, let everybody in. And the other side says, the union side, the labor side said, are you nuts? They're taking American jobs. And so at the national level, things have been, did I say this last week? I think I said this last week. Did I say this last week? I didn't say this last week. Okay, anyway, so at the national level, they've been very happy to collect that Social Security money. And they've been very happy to just ignore it and keep business very happy. And one side, of the Democratic Party say, well, let's be compassionate, let people in, and so forth and so on. And you can see the arguments on both sides all over the place, okay? Bottom line is we need workers. We have a shortage. We aborted a third of our children. Okay, that's political, but that's one I feel comfortable on, and I know that's a sensitive topic, but still, it's a lot of people. And so then you get the Social Security thing, which was encouraging, and I don't know, it's just a mess. When Hormel a couple of years ago, now I'm going to get off on a tangent here. So the whole immigration issue is fraught with all kinds of challenges and all kinds of pressures from all kinds of different sides, and it's not a simple thing. And they're going to have to come up with an answer as to how to deal with it, because our businesses can't function without immigrants unless we all start having a lot more kids. which, you know, again, I don't think that's going to happen. You know, same thing's happening in Europe. You know, in Spain right now, I think the birth rate's like 1.2 babies per couple. Most of Western Europe, it's about 2 babies per couple, right around. And frankly, they aren't replacing their population. And so, yes, they've had this big bunch of refugees, but they're also just really short on labor. And so this stuff is happening everywhere, but it's happening in Uruguay. People are in Costa Rica. I told you about the Chinese restaurants there. People from everywhere are going every place else. Thousands, tens of thousands of Americans are retiring in Costa Rica. It's a very small globe, and anybody who really wants to get someplace else on the globe can get there. Okay, well, thank you for your reflections on those things. Let's take a little break right now. We're a little late on that, and then we're going to watch Patty Lane's video. Grab some goodies. Who made cupcakes? Did you make cupcakes? I think they're very nice, but yeah, please, we don't want this to become a burden to anybody. So, okay, go. You got 10 minutes. Anybody has any questions or comments or whatever? Come and talk to me.
Going back to what are we doing after this? Well, we're gonna skip it because we want to say hi after class, and 2, we can miss.
When we get done with this class, of course, you'll remember everything I said and all the tremendous insights and wisdom that I have regurgitated upon you. Well, anyway, hopefully you'll come out of this with some stuff you'll remember. I think from the feedback we get from our earlier students. Forgive me, I don't take myself real seriously, but the students that have taken the class before say that they have found an awful lot of this stuff has been very useful. One of the things that I say to most classes is that we will be sharing a lot of stuff with you and a lot of stuff about ministry, and some of it may not make sense. But you will find as you get into ministry, it's going to be when you click on a drop-down menu and it goes brrrp. When you get to that point in life, you're going to hit that drop-down menu, and this stuff is going to come back, and all of a sudden, you'll realize why we taught it to you. And this, I've had many students come back to me and say, that's why you taught that. This class is based on a lifetime of beginning and creating ministry. My ministry from the time I was a youth director has been going into, I didn't set out to do this, by the way, to go into situations that other people had given up on or that were falling apart and rebuild them. I did it as a youth director and working with Bible camps and congregations and so forth. And in fact, one of my buddies said, "Raul, you're the patron saint of lost causes." Thanks, Dana. Anyway, but the idea of how do you go in and figure out what the job is, how do you figure out how to do ministry in a given setting, is the first part of understanding how to be a leader, how to be an entrepreneur. And Lord knows we need entrepreneurs in the church very, very badly. And an entrepreneur doesn't mean you got to be a, be a Joel Osteen. An entrepreneur is someone who just goes into a situation and recognizes what's going on and sees how the parts go together and says, hey guys, 2 or 3 friends, let's go do this. You don't need money. You don't necessarily need anybody's permission. Yeah, there's times you got to put other pieces together and bring other people in on it. But all it takes is a vision. The Bible says where there's no vision, it's a Lutheran parish. No. Where there's, well, you can say an American parish, but whatever. But no, where there's no vision, it's the people perish. Well, they do. They do, and the church is perishing because we've got a lot of pastors who see themselves as individual chaplains, and the church is just going to kind of always go on, and it's not. It's not. We lost most of the baby boomers. We lost most of Gen X. We lost most of the millennials. And we don't make it up by numbers. People don't have 6, 8, 10, 12 kids anymore. So anyway, that. So as we begin to look at this, the idea of what is a culture, and getting this into your head, and getting you comfortable with the idea of the city and what's going on in the city, we can't teach the one without teaching the other and kind of wrapping them around each other like a candy cane. And so that's what these first few weeks are. I am going to try to do as good a job as possible of connecting the dots. We're going to be teaching you a lot of different pieces, and if you wonder how does this connect to anything, I hope that won't happen, but if it does, ask. I will try to connect the pieces for you. But tonight we've talked about, that was the introduction of what's going on in this world. We talked a little bit about that last time. We talked a little bit about Minneapolis and saw that. You got started on Patty Lane's book. Now, as far as getting the books, we buy them for you, and we get them at the cost of, we sell them to you at about the cost of what it is with postage and so forth. If you really do need to have those books and have them on time. And as you learned, sometimes Amazon doesn't get there fast enough. Thriftbooks.com. $5.60. Well, that's a good deal, but you didn't get it in time. Reality took hold. Yes. All right. Well, we won't do. We'll make it be a light beating. All right. I'm kidding. Okay. You'll get used to my sense of humor. I say outrageous things occasionally, and I hope if anybody's ever offended by something I say is humor, please, if you are offended, please talk to me, because I'll get down on my knees and apologize. But I say outrageous things every once in a while. I try to be good. My wife usually says something, okay, now be good tonight. I usually say, why start something new? Anyway, so what we're going to do tonight is Patty Lane is an amazing speaker. I got to meet her in 2002 down at Charlotte, and she is the head of cross-cultural for the Southern Baptists. And she wrote her book, and the book is just a hoot. I enjoy the book very much. Now, I want to explain one thing. In her book, she talks about cultures, and she talks about different ways to look at them, calls them different lenses. You could say different facets, looking through the different ways to look at it. The hardest one that she writes about is the lens of context. And I think you can get by better if you use the term respect interchangeably with context, because it deals with respect because of reputation, age, having degrees, reverend, having elders. When we had the National Ethnic Summit here in Minneapolis 15 years ago, 2003, that we brought people together of just all kinds of different backgrounds. And that night the Koreans came from the Korean church, and they were dressed up. All the men were in suits, and the women were dressed to the nines. And one of the worship leaders was a young guy, probably 21, 22 years old, and he was up there in a T-shirt and jeans with holes in them. And their leader came up to the person in charge of the evening and said, "This cannot be. You cannot let him lead worship. That's disrespectful. Look how he's dressed." Our people are just incensed that this young man is allowed to be up in front and leading worship. You should have your oldest person, most respected leader up leading worship. And this young man dressed as he is, our people are deeply offended. Now that's culture. That's culture. 40 years ago in America, people didn't go to church without at least a sport coat, if not a suit, because that was about respect. That was culture. We'll talk. There's a lot of culture in churches. Okay. So anyway, Patty Lane is going to outline her whole book in the next half hour. That's what we're going to listen to. Now, don't try to absorb everything she says, because you're going to get all this in her book. But I want you to get the basic framework. This whole class is about building a framework. A few times in my life, I've bought a house, and the garage had been completely cleaned out. There were no shelves, and there weren't even any nails in the wall. And so, you've got the snow shovel, and you've got the extension cord, and you've got maybe a rope you want to hang up, and you've got the hoe. Doesn't everybody own a hoe? Okay, yeah, and then there's the narrow hoe, and then there's the round, short number 2 shovel, and there's the long number 2 shovel, and then there's the flat bottom number 3 shovel. Well, anyway, everybody's got those, right? And that's some number 1, so you can plant trees. So you got to run around with a bunch of 20-penny nails and say, we're going to hang this up here, and you just put all these nails in the wall, and then you can start hanging your stuff up. And you get your garage organized by hanging all that stuff on the walls, right? Anybody ever done that? Am I the only one that's ever done that? Okay, yeah, okay, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, what this class is about is we're putting nails in your walls. We're giving you a structure, a thought structure that's been very carefully honed for 24 years. Talked about, thought about, prayed about, worked on, every year changed a little bit to give you a framework for the rest of your life to hang your idea of ministry, your idea of the kingdom of God, what God is up to, the idea of culture, how to learn. We want you to come out of here curious. We want you to ask why. Okay, that's what education is about. when we were teaching their U4C classes here, I would always tell the students, okay, now, if you think you're going to look this stuff up on your phone and you're going to, if you need to learn that, you can learn that someday. That's like saying, I've got a college education, I live next to the library. If you don't build stuff in your head, if you don't know anything, you don't know anything. Just knowing that you can access the information, if you haven't built the structure into your head, if you don't understand the complexity of the city and the things that make it up, you don't know anything. And it takes a long time, and as I've said, what happens is that people who are led by the Spirit, called by the Spirit of God, God really wanted to use them, but they were clueless. And so they failed miserably. And it was terrible because the church needed them. God needed them. But they didn't know how to start to learn. And they, by nature, for some reason, didn't start asking questions. So what we're doing tonight, and what we're doing all the way through this class, is putting nails in the wall. Okay? Does that make sense? We're talking about? Okay. We're teaching you to learn, and learn in a certain way. And I'll quit talking and let you watch the video. Okay. This is Patricia Lane. Today's Mission Shift video is about culture. We have one of the most important and best presenters on cultures in the United States, who's going to be our lecturer today, Patty Lane. Patty Lane is the head of cross-cultural communication, cross-cultural outreach for the Southern Baptist, headquartered in Dallas. And she's a marvelous speaker, and she's a lot of fun. Hope that you're really going to enjoy this. On with the show.
Hello, my name is Patty Lane. We're going to spend the next few minutes talking about the influence of culture and how we behave, and how we can, as we learn about culture, we can help to build better relationships with people of any culture that we come across. The first thing that I want us to think about is the fact that all of us as humans have much more in common with each other than we have different from each other. But we do have those things that influence who we are, the ways in which we think, the values that we have, things such as our spiritual development, our life experiences, our personality, our gender. All of those things impact how we think. But what we do know is that even though those are very powerful factors that shape who we are, the thing that gives meaning and value to even those factors is our culture. And so we're going to be focused today on the impact of culture and what we need to understand about culture as we look at building relationships with people from across the world who are now living within our country. The first thing that I think is important for us is just to have a basic understanding of what is culture. And the definition that I like to use is that culture is a system of meaning and values that shape one's behavior. The reason that we need to have a definition is because we need to understand that culture is not something that we are born with. Culture is not in our DNA. It's not part of our biology. Culture is learned, and it is learned from our family, from those people who are around us, who begin to shape us from the moment we are born into what things are important and what things will be priority and what will be the way in which we look at life. There is a quote that says, "Culture is always, at the very least, a silent participant in all of our interactions." It is true that we never do anything, we never have a conversation, we never have an interaction where culture is not a factor. Just to illustrate this a little bit, I will show you these two pictures. The pictures describe an event. There's a picture of, the first picture has two people, they're street vendors, and they're selling a fruit, a product on the street. They have the same location, they have the same product, and they have the same price. In the second picture, we have the same two street vendors, and they are selling a product, same location, but one of these vendors has now lowered his price. So his price is lower than his neighbor's. What some researchers did a few years ago was they took a group of business people from the United States and from the Philippines, and they showed them these two pictures. And they asked them, can you tell us what's going on with these two pictures? The first group from the United States who responded said, well, this is very easy. Why would you even ask such a question? Obviously, you have a very good entrepreneur who is out there. He wants to make a good living. He wants to sell his product. And he realized with the same product, the same location, he needed to alter his price if he was going to be able to sell more than his competitor. When the Filipinos came back and gave their story, they said, well, this is very easy. We don't even know why you would ask us such a question, because it's obvious what has happened here. You have a person who cares more about making money and selling a product than he cares about his neighbor. You obviously have a person who does not have good character. You can see that while the pictures were the same and both groups of people came from a business background, their interpretation of these two pictures was very, very different. What made the difference? Their culture. It had taught them to value things differently and see the world differently. Now think about it. If that sort of difference could be derived from two pictures, what is the opportunity and what is the likelihood that things about us that happen in our everyday interactions could also be seen very, very differently based upon our culture? What we know as we look at culture is that a lot of culture is visible. It's what's on top of the surface of the water, what we see as recognizable from just visible clues. But the majority of what is culture is really beneath the surface of the water. Those are the things that motivate or drive the behaviors that we see. Things like belief systems, value systems.
You will find that they act differently, people, when you're working with people. Now, for example, if you go out in the street and you start talking with a Native American person who's raised in the Native American culture, typically a Native American person will not look you in the eye when they're talking to you. You know, we joke about this. An extroverted Norwegian is one who looks at your shoes when he's talking to you. Okay, we can joke about that, but in a Native American, I'm half Norwegian, so I can get away with that. In a Native American culture, it's considered rude, mean, and disrespectful to look somebody right in the eye. That's just not the way you do it. You don't look, you don't establish eye contact. That's more for people who you're very close to and so forth. So every culture has these things that they do differently, clothes they wear, food they eat, the way they greet. If you ever talk to a Somali or an Oromo or an Amharic person and you say, how are you? And they'll say, oh, good. Now, if you stop there, you're an American. But then you say, well, how's your family? Oh, they're doing well. And the kids are doing well in school? Yeah. How are your parents? Good. I remember dealing with our Oromo pastor, who we worked together with here for about 10 years. The first time I met him, I said, how are you? He said, fine. I said, and how is your family? And he literally did a double take. He stood up straighter, his eyes got big, and he smiled. He was very surprised that I entered his culture. Now, that's not much of an entry. And I still don't understand much about Oromo culture. After 55 years, I don't understand Latino culture. A little bit. But this is the thing, is that the way beliefs and values and feelings, all of this is creating this. This is the objective, the stuff you can see, but the subjective, the feeling, the thinking, the internal stuff. What are gender roles of women and men? What's normal? What motivates them? What about, all these things at every one of these lenses is going to create a difference. The bottom line is this, and I should have said this earlier. There is somebody in this town, probably, every instance of how you understand the world works, that person understands it 180 degrees the other way. There are people for whom this means no. There are people in this town, when you ask them something, they will always give you the answer that you want first. But then if you stop for a little bit, like I just did, then they'll give you the answer that they're actually thinking. But that's how you work to not be rude, okay? So all of this stuff, you've got the stuff you can see, and that may or may not make sense. But you can't interpret this until you understand what's going on down here, and this is where the learning comes in. If you interpret it according to your meaning, like looking somebody that's not looking in the eye, well, what does that mean? That means they're probably lying to you. No. It means they're of a different culture. Is that making sense? Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, is that Native American, eye contact thing, is that still a thing that they practice?
Is the Native American thing of eye contact? Yes. There are Native American people who are used to, a majority or white culture or whatever, but as a norm, I can't shut off being a Scandinavian American. If I'm standing talking to somebody, here, stand up for a second. Now, if I was, come on out here. If I was a Latino person and I was going to talk to you, I'd come up right here and I'd talk like this, and this would feel comfortable for them. And yeah, now for me and you, it's about here. But now, as a Scandinavian American, this isn't comfortable to me. I'll just kind of shift around, and I've got to open it up because it's too confrontive. I don't like sitting across the table from somebody I'm having a business meeting. I'd rather be 90 degrees to them. Or if I have to be across the table, I usually kind of move my chair a little bit because it just feels like I'm being really confrontational, right? That's wired in me, and I can't shut it off. I laugh at it. And here on Sundays when we had a, Latino church following the Gringo church, we got to be buddies. But as they were talking together, the Latinos would move up, and the Gringos would kind of, go like this, and then talk. And then the Latino feels too far away, and they'd come closer and closer. Just a second. This is my number one son who's in Oregon. Are you okay? Okay. I'm teaching right now. Say hi to the class. Say hi, class. Hi, John. I'll call you later. Bye. I promised him I'd always pick up. I could be getting chased by a bear or something. Okay, anyway, so culture, a lot of different things, but that's a difference of space, personal space. Now, if you're going to talk to a Latino person and show them respect, you got to anchor yourself, even though it feels uncomfortable. They're coming up and they're invading your personal space. If you're a Scandinavian American, it's about 2 more inches, It's like, and our people. So, you got these couples talking to one each, waltzing through the narthex because, and they're liking each other, but the Scandinavian Americans are kind of trying to very slowly escape. I'm slower than I'm doing it now. They'd be talking and, gradually like this, and you got all these couples of people, and they're all moving like that. Culture. Was there another question over here? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm
standing in line, and 4 Latino students came up.
Yeah.
There's nobody else in line behind them.
Yeah.
And they're standing right next to me.
Yeah, with the Latino students at Wendy's, and they're standing right behind you. Yeah, well, that's personal space. Kind of like Italian drivers with Fiats, and I'll tell you about that next time. Okay, let's move on. On with the show. Okay.
Systems, motivational systems, authority. Those are the things that drive behaviors that we see that are visible. Now, oftentimes what happens in the United States when people are here from other cultures is that that visible part of culture begins to diminish as if the iceberg is actually melting. That part becomes often smaller and smaller. And many times we relate to people of other cultures and we're not aware of it because the visible cues that we look for are not so visible anymore. Maybe the person looks like we do. They wear the clothes, they eat the food, the mannerisms, the ways in which greetings are done are all the same. And so we mistakenly believe that that person has the same culture, the same value system, the same belief system that we do. But oftentimes that is not the case. That part of the iceberg that's beneath the surface of the water is still there and still very much intact. And in fact, the very bedrock in which culture is built is upon a person's worldview. That is what a person believes to be real in the world. That is their worldview. And that is very, very difficult to change. And it's important to know that these parts of culture that are beneath the surface of the water are usually there throughout a person's lifetime. It is very difficult to change those subjective parts and worldview parts of culture. But as believers, we know that through the Holy Spirit, we can make changes to those parts of who we are. Now, one of the most important things I want you to come away with from this video series is the understanding of misattribution. Misattribution means ascribing a motive or a meaning to a behavior based upon one's own culture or experience. We see that misattributions are a large part of why we can have cross-cultural misunderstandings. Misattributions would be things such as understanding that for your culture it is seen to be a sign of respect to look someone in the eye and talk with them. But for many other cultures, and especially for people who are younger than you would be, that may actually be seen as a sign of disrespect. So if we look at the behavior, we see someone who doesn't look us in the eye when they talk to us, we can look at it from our cultural perspective and maybe think, they're not paying attention, they're not interested, they're not respecting me, they're not listening. But when we see it from their perspective, what their behavior, maybe eyes that are downcast or not making a direct eye contact, for them, for that person, they are actually showing respect. They're showing that they are listening, that they do care about what's being said. To look at that behavior and to say, well, they don't respect me, they're not interested, would be to make a misattribution. What we must always do in working with someone of another culture is not to understand what does their behavior mean to me, but what does their behavior mean to them? What is it they're trying to communicate through their behavior? And that would mean understanding their culture so that those understandings could be done. Things such as, what does respect look like? How do people of different cultures show respect to each other? In one culture, it may be shown one way, in another, a very, very different way. What does trust look like? What does anger look like? What would agreement look like? Those are the kinds of things that as we work with people of other culture, we must come to understand what that would be like for them. Now, as we work, what I have discovered is that there are many ways in which people respond to cross-cultural situations and being around people of other cultures. One of those ways is almost a xenophobia, a fear of culture, where there's like an obvious clash of some sort. Another way of responding is just to feel very confused, to feel, I don't understand what they're thinking, I don't understand what's going on, and so I just want to avoid the whole situation because I don't understand it. Another way of looking at it is to say, I like the way that other culture is, and I like the way my culture is, but I think the best way for us to relate to each other is just to live our lives separately. You live over here, I'll leave you alone. I'll live over here, you leave me alone. Another way of responding is to say, I want to have acceptance. I want to accept other cultures and be welcoming of other cultures. But oftentimes, while that sounds very positive, as we think about it, it also can have a meaning of wanting conformity. I'll accept you, but over time I want you to become more and more like me. The last way in which I see people responding is probably the way in which I think we would want to aim for, and that would be that of celebration. Understanding that our cultures are different, people are different, we view the world differently, and that is not good nor bad, but it is something that we can come together, learn from each other, grow from each other, and celebrate those differences and how they can make us each better people as we become exposed to and understand some of those cultural differences. One of the things that we can also learn is just some basic principles of crossing culture. We must understand our own cultural values. The first thing in being able to work with other cultures is to know who you are culturally. Another thing to do is to understand archetypes. Archetypes are not stereotypes. Archetypes are an understanding of a culture based upon what people of that culture say about themselves. What anthropologists do is they do research, they interview, and they do surveys with hundreds, maybe thousands of people from a culture group. They find those areas where there is consensus. And then those areas of consensus are what develop the archetype for that culture. Understanding those archetypes give us a place from which to begin to understand our neighbors who are from other places. It does not mean that every person you meet from Korea will fit the archetype of a Korean, but it does give you a place to start to begin to understand what some of that background may be about. And so understanding archetypes is a good way to build a skill set that makes you equipped to work with other cultures. Another one is to avoid misattributions, which we talked about a minute ago, and to also avoid stereotypes. No one likes to be stereotyped. Probably everyone listening to this tape will have had an experience where they have been stereotyped, and it wasn't a positive experience. Stereotypes usually take one aspect of who a person is, where they're from geographically, how they look, what kind of occupation they're in. It takes that one aspect of who they are and tries to build out to say, from that one thing, I know other things about you. People don't like being stereotyped. And so it is not a positive way for us to build relationships to work off stereotypes. We should always have an understanding of archetypes, but not use those to stereotype people. Value all people. Be interested in who they are. That's going to go a long way in building relationships. Be intentional about meeting people and getting to know them and asking questions and revealing things about yourself. Be intentional about relationship building. Create mutual relationships. Have those relationships where you are giving and you are receiving. That other people are giving and receiving. That will create healthy relationships. Be a learner. Ask questions. Listen to what people tell you. And don't try to be what you're not. Don't say you understand what you can't possibly understand. Be authentic. Be yourself. And most of all, to be humble. As we work with people of other cultures, it's usually considered very offensive to come across as a person who knows more, who has greater experience. Be humble in who you are and always be willing to learn from someone else. What I want us to do now is to look at the 6 cultural lenses that shape who everyone in the world is. We have these lenses, and it would be very, very time-consuming to talk about each one related to every culture in the world. But what I want to do for us is to talk about that lens, talk about the 2 extremes of that lens, the high end and the low end. And as we talk about the lens of context, we'll be talking about high context cultures and low context cultures. You might want to think about this as you see a football field, and you have the 2 end zones, which would be the 2 extremes, which we'll be talking about today, and then think about the halfway, the 50-yard mark is the halfway mark. So some groups will be on one side of the 50, Others will be on the other side of the 50. The closer groups are to the 50-yard mark, the more similar they may be to each other, but still separated by those that would be considered high context and low context. As we think about that, let's talk about what context really means. This term comes from the idea of some cultures value the context of interaction much more so than others do. High context being the cultures that value the context of interactions, low context cultures putting less value on those, the context or the environment of interaction. Another significant difference is that with high context cultures, people believe that they are responsible for communication. How that plays itself out is, as they listen to someone speak, their assumption is that they should be the one who is understanding, and if understanding is not taking place, it is not the fault of the speaker. It is their fault. They're not smart enough, they're not listening well, they don't have enough background, whatever the case may be, it is their responsibility to understand the information. In a low context culture, the opposite is true. The speaker feels responsible for communication. So if the audience has not understood what the speaker has said, the speaker will generally want to rephrase it, say it again, give an illustration, do something to make that communication as clear as possible because they feel like they are the ones responsible for communication. Another distinction is that with high context cultures, there's not as strong a difference between an idea a person has and the person themselves. In other words, if you're a good person, a smart person, you have good and smart ideas. If you're a person who's does not have good character, is not seen as reputable, then your ideas, even if they're very good ideas, will not be seen as valuable because there's such a strong connection between the person and the ideas that they have. That is a characteristic of high context. Whereas in a low context culture, you can have relationships with people, even picture for yourself a visit to the doctor. You may go to a doctor whose personality you don't like, and maybe you don't even feel like he would be a person you would want to have as a friend or in any kind of social setting. But you know that he does a very good job fixing what's wrong with you. You're still going to go to him, you're going to take his advice, you're going to listen to what he says and follow it. Experience, that is another thing that makes it a distinction. In high context cultures, experience is equal to facts. If your experience with something is one way, it doesn't matter how many facts, data, information, numbers, whatever can be presented to you, it will not override what your own experience has been. A distinction with low
Okay, so again, when you're talking high context, we're talking respect. So that someone will be more listened to if they have more degrees, if they're the senior pastor, if they've got gray hair. This is not all bad. If they are known to be famous in the community or have respect in the community, their ideas will be more widely accepted than some young pup, even if the young pup is correct, simply because of the respect deal. There are cultures. Our culture is flat. I can walk up to the mayor and say, "Hey, mayor," or call him by their first name or whatever. Back when we were in our former church body, I could walk up to the leader of the church body and say, "Hey, Bish, how you doing?" In other cultures, you'd be making a terrible, terrible, terrible faux pas doing something like that. We are very extremely low context culture, because we celebrate the fact that we're all equal. We celebrate the fact that we're a land of equals. Everybody is made equally, and we hate having the person who acts like they're better than anybody else, right? The person who is wealthy, or the person that has the fancy accent or whatever. Ever watch the old TV show MASH? And there was this surgeon that came in as a replacement about halfway through. I can't remember his name, but he had a British accent, and it was a high class Boston accent of a high family there, and he was like Abercrombie something or another, Fenselwisser the fourth or something, and everybody hated him because he was putting on such airs, because he considered himself to be so clearly superior to everybody else, right? We just don't accept that in America. Everybody's the same. Now, I'm sorry, if you're one of the top 1%, you're probably really not the same, but we like to pretend you're all the same. Okay, so, but in other cultures, if people, respect is a huge thing. And maybe we'll bounce out of it, but it's been, ever since World War II, our context has gotten to be less and less and less and less. And again, we don't dress up for stuff. We talk casually to people. We don't dress up for church. The Bible doesn't say you have to be dressed up for church. But, again, respect, showing respect to whom respect is due, in some cultures is just, it's so incredibly important. You'll never get anything. Well, for example, if a young guy comes up and starts, let me go out further. I have 4 friends that I have played in bands with for 50 years. One has an advanced degree, today it would be beyond a doctorate in physical therapy. Great leader, great human being. Another one is a genius in computer science, and he's a piano player, and he's got hands that are a 12th, which means he can go from a C to a C to a G with each hand. Yeah, and another one's a doctor, and I've known him since about 1st grade. And he claims second, I say first, well, whatever. Anyway, and then that's the 4 of us, and we've all, pretty much stayed out of jail, and we've had a pretty good careers and around the different parts of the country. But we get together, and it's interesting, we will joke with each other, and we'll make fun of each other. But even with that, my doctor friend is only about 5'5". I would never tell a short joke, because that would be showing. Men will make fun of each other, like on a golf course or something, up to a certain point. Only with people for whom they have tremendous respect for. They can kind of needle around the edges with a very important set of rules. There's limits to that. I don't know exactly what they are, but you feel it when you get over to the edge, right? And but if a young guy came up to me, somebody that I was working with, and starts making fun of me or making fun of one of them, they would be deeply offended. But basically, if it was in a company, that guy's career would be over like right now. We still have some of that. Does that make sense? Men are more obsessed with respect. Yeah. Could be.
The
Yep.
president had shown up late to some publicity thing,
Mm-hmm.
and so he had sat on the steps just with the rest of the people there instead of
Uh-huh.
just place of honor or whatever.
Yeah, like if a president steps out, gets out of his limousine and shakes hands, we love that. Secret Service goes nuts, but we'll talk about male and female. If we really want to be dangerous, women are much better at relationships, and they're not as obsessed with the respect type thing. Women like to be respected, don't get me wrong, and men like to have relationships. But there's a little difference there, even between genders in our culture. There are differences generationally in our culture between these things. So, all right, so anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what this thing is about context, because it's extremely important it has so many different points of impact, but this is how it works itself out, okay?
Context culture is how people think. In low context cultures, people think in analytical thinking. They like to take things apart, look at them as their parts, and then put them all together to make the whole. Whereas in high context cultures, they like to look at the whole part, the whole thing that's being dealt with, and what's referred to as holistic thinking, not trying so much to dissect. Where this would make a difference is in strategic planning, things in which people would look at a strategy based upon lots of parts coming together to make a whole. In most other cultures in the world, strategic planning needs to be done from a holistic perspective, looking at where do we want to be when this is all finished, and go about it almost from a time regression rather than a part dissection. The next lens that we want to look at is that of relationships. The two extremes of the football field here are going to be collective cultures and individual cultures. Collective cultures are defined by having an identity within the group, having an expectation that they will take care of members of the group and members of the group will take care of them. And they expect to be rewarded by their loyalty, because of their loyalty. With individual cultures, the identity is within oneself. There's an expectation that one would take care of oneself and that others would take care of themselves. And that rewards of any kind would come based upon what a person has done, what they have achieved, what they merit. This has a great impact in how we do work in collective cultures. If you're from an individual culture and you're working with someone from a collective culture, especially in the presentation of the gospel, it would be very important to know that it might be very difficult for someone to break away or distance themselves from the rest of their family, village of origin, their country of origin. That might be very difficult. And so in the gospel presentation, it may be more advantageous to present that to a whole family group, to an extended family group, so that people could hear the information simultaneously and be able to process that, think about that, talk about that within their collective group, rather than trying to process that all as individuals. But it also means that there are times when that's not really feasible or possible. And so for the people who may make professions of faith, who come from collective cultures, a support system would need to be put in place so the person doesn't feel like, I've left everything I've ever known, and I'm now a follower of Christ, and yet I now have no place to belong, no family, no identity really. So being able to be aware of this distinction would be very important as ministry takes place with collective cultures. The next lens that we need to discuss is that of activity. How we go about thinking about how we spend our time. And the two differences here, the two ends of the field, of the football field, would be that of being cultures and that of doing cultures. Being cultures are those that focus on the quality of life and on relationships. Doing cultures focus on getting results, materialism, and achievements. Now, this does not mean that every person in the world doesn't care about relationships, cares about the quality of their life, cares about getting results, having achievements. It doesn't mean that. What it means is that when those values come into conflict with each other, which one will more often win out over the other? For being cultures, relationships will win out. If having to choose between getting a paper done and getting it in on time or helping a friend, helping the friend will usually win. In a doing culture, the opposite may be the case. The friend may be put on hold while the paper gets done, and then they would want to go back and deal with their friend. The next lens that we will look at is that of authority. The authority lens has the two ends of the football field being hierarchical cultures and egalitarian cultures. Hierarchical cultures are those that have a set protocol, a set list of who has more status than someone else. Those could be based upon family names. It could be based upon the position in the culture, in the society. It could be based upon wealth. It could be based upon their caste. It could be based upon many, many things. Egalitarian cultures are those cultures that say, at our very core of who we are, what we believe is that all people are equal. If I ask the question of you listening to this video, who could ask a question? Who can ask a question of your facilitator or of your teacher? You would probably easily say, well, anyone could ask the question. But for other groups, those that are hierarchical, the answers could come back very differently. The answer could come back, well, only the men. Because in that system of beliefs, men have higher status than women, so they would be the ones to ask the questions. It may come back, only the oldest, only those with gray hair or no hair can ask questions, because it's the oldest in the society that has the higher status, and they would be allowed to ask questions, but not the younger people. For some, it may even come back, no one. They will not be able to question a teacher. They would see the teacher as having the highest status, so why would they be able to ask them a question? They should just sit and listen and receive what the teacher wants to give them. The next lens is that of time, or the temporal lens. Here we have cultures that have different ways of looking at time. Now, typically people think this means, well, when things start. We have jokes about people who start later than the time they've actually stated they'll start. I like to tell people that it's not about starting late. Some groups start late. It's not about that. Every group starts on time. They just have a different way of telling time. For some people, time is told by what's on a clock, what's on their watch. And then when the time says 7 o'clock, and we said the meeting would start at 7, then the meeting starts. For other groups, the 7 o'clock may have just been a guideline of we'd all try to get there around 7 o'clock. But it's not going to start on time until everyone who needs to be there is there. When everyone's there who needs to be there, that's on time, and that's when they'll start. Now, most people who've worked with other cultures have experienced that sort of thing and have found ways to work with that. But there's another very interesting part of dealing with this lens of time. The differences between some cultures would be those that have historical view of time and those that have an evolving view of time. People with an historical view of time are people who look at life and say, I started at point A, and I'm moving to point B, and I'm going to point C. And as they move through life, it is almost like a snowball. All the parts of A, what was happening in that part of my life, gets rolled into point B and rolled into point C. And as I move through life, I see my present moment encompassing all of my past. And those past experiences, even if they're not mine, even if they're from generations before me, they have been taught to me and they are a part of my present moment. For people with a linear view of time or an evolving view of time, they move in life from point A to point B to point C, and on they go, and at each point they're looking forward to the next place they'll be going. And the things of their past are not so much present with them, not so much in their conscious awareness, and not so much playing a part of how they see their present moment. This is a huge difference in looking at time, because for many people with a linear view of time, they look at people with a historical view of time and say, forget about all that. That happened in the past. That didn't happen to you. That was a long time ago. And they want people to separate themselves from that. But that makes no sense to a person with an historical view of time, because that would be like saying, don't count what's here in the present moment. Because all those things, all those stories that they've heard, all those experiences of the past are present with them in this very moment. As we do ministry with people who have a different view of time, we need to be very sensitive to this distinction, not only in what makes something on time, but also how people are going to view the past as part of the present. The very last lens we're going to look at is that of worldview. Worldview is a huge topic, and one in which we could spend many, many hours discussing. What I want us just to think about here today is to realize that worldview has to do with what is real in people's minds. It is their reality. And you might say, well, everyone would have the same notion of what is real. Things that are real are things we see and that we touch, that we feel, that we experience in some way. But actually, people can look at worldview and what is real very, very differently. One way in which you can approach this is to look at the difference between a pre-modern, a modern, and a postmodern worldview. Worldview can be a very, very complex issue, and which would take a lot of hours of study. But just to think about it and to realize that worldview deals with what is really real and what people believe to be real. If we think about the issue of what causes illnesses, for some people, what causes illnesses are germs, bacteria, some sort of physical abnormality. And we think that if that's what causes illnesses, the way to fix that illness is to be able to take a medicine, have a surgery, something that will eradicate whatever the problem is. But for other people in other places in the world, what causes illnesses is a disharmony with the energy flow within your body. For those people to fix an illness, they're not going to seek out medicine, they're going to seek out acupuncture or acupressure to help restore the balance of energy. Now, the other people who believe that what causes illnesses is having a broken relationship with a person, with nature, or with the gods. Some people may think what causes illnesses is their soul has left them. And in order to be restored to health, their soul must be restored to them. Now you can see these are very, very different approaches, but each one is real for the person who holds that belief. And what we've discovered is that many times people who have difficulty taking medicine and getting better, they're not getting better. But rather than saying, now I'll see if maybe I should have my soul restored, they don't go to that new worldview. They just try to find a different doctor or different medicines. They don't change worldviews if their worldview is not working. So it's a very, very powerful concept to understand what worldview is and the power of that. I want to leave you with just one thought, and that is that all things that we do related to working with people of other cultures is that of building relationships. The key to cross-cultural friendships, the key to cross-cultural relationships is to always put the relationship first, to be able to see the value in people and to be able to enjoy and know that we've learned and we can appreciate the differences that God has brought to us through bringing to us many, many cultures here to the United States. Thank you.
You've had a chance now to hear Patty Lane's presentation. Patty Lane's book, A Beginner's Guide to Crossing Cultures, is required reading for courses all across the United States. All right, now. Let's mute that. Okay, so as we talk about any of these aspects, you can kind of get a sense that there's a tremendous possibility for confusion, for conflict, for offense. Let me just tell you a couple of stories before we finish this area, or finish this part of this area. Probably about 15 years ago, we had an Amharic, that's one of the Ethiopian groups, Amharic evangelical / Pentecostal church that worshiped with us. And they worshiped on Sunday afternoons, and they prayed every Friday night until the middle of the night. And tremendous church, tremendous church. They prayed all the drug dealers away from us in the middle of the crack wars, which is amazing. And our people pray. Our people pray like crazy, but these people, you know, it was like Little League versus the New York Yankees. Well, they finally saved up enough money that they could buy their own building over on East 7th Street in St. Paul. And they said, well, we'd like you to be our guest, our honored guest, so what time should we be there? I said, noon. So my wife being okay, now see, I'm half Norwegian, a quarter Irish, and a quarter mixed Yankee. And there are differences between all those groups, okay? And there's some Southerner thrown in there. And my wife is 100% German. And that's a different cultural norm. And half of that is Prussian. Ugh. So when we say 12 o'clock, when we're going to be someplace at 12 o'clock, I have to go around the block once or twice unless it's, so we get there at 12 o'clock. If we've got to be to her mom's house when her mom was alive, at 1 o'clock, it meant 12:59:55. And if we were there any earlier than that, you weren't supposed to be the first one there. But if somebody was there before, then you could go in. This is the unwritten rule someplace. So we have to be there at noon. So we pull in at 11:59:55 and pull up in front. There's no cars there. We knock on the door, and there's a couple ladies in the kitchen, and I said, "Oh, what time does it start?" "Oh, noon." Okay, so we sat on the sofa, we talked. 1 o'clock came. Ladies are still busy in the kitchen. 2 o'clock came. Ladies are still busy in the kitchen. 3 o'clock, the pastor walks in. I said, did we get something wrong? What time does it start? "Oh, noon." Okay. 4 o'clock, some other people start showing up, and finally at about 4:30, then the congregation starts showing up for noon. Okay, like our Latino pastor here always says, well, no, it's green goat time. You got to be here, and he'll always give it a half an hour earlier than it's supposed to be, because it's green goat time. And he'll joke with his people, no, it's green goat time. So there's a different sense of time. Now, we all know that we have the right idea of time, right? Okay, well, I learned that I have a very different sense of time. I usually go with the 10% rule. If if it's 10 o'clock in the morning, if you're 10 minutes late or 10 minutes early, close enough. No. I'm married to a German, and her sense of what time was meant, 1 o'clock went 1 o'clock, right then, or 5 seconds before. Okay, in the Bible, New Testament, there's 2 words for time. Are you familiar with these? One is chronos, like chronometer, and the other word is kairos. And kairos means time, like you remember the time? Or we had a good time. Now, when somebody says, yeah, we had a good time, do you say, well, what was it, 3:17? 3:20? You remember the time? Well, was that 8:15? No, I mean, you remember the time when we saw the moose on the side of the road? Oh, what time? What? No, it's not about the time. That's 2 different words for time. We've got 1 word for time. Okay, the Greeks would have said kairos. Kairos is when everybody gets there, or when an event happens. And that's the way much of the world thinks about time. We think in terms of chronos, which is 11:59:55. And that's different, and that's alien to many people. Now, you got to realize that if you have ancestors who are Korean or Japanese or Chinese, Northern Chinese, or German or Russian, or French or Scandinavian, if you didn't get the crops in that small window of chronos, the time, and if you didn't get that crop back out, I just feel terrible for my friends down in southern Minnesota who are going to have 2 to 4 inches of rain right now, because they've got soybeans, and soybeans are only about $3.65 a bushel. No, that's corn. I'm sorry, corn. And soybeans are under 7, which is, these are both under cost of production. So now if they've got to put a bunch of LP into them to dry them, it's they're really losing a lot of money. And their fields are being turned into gumbo. Well, you know, they're really nervous about the chronos, the time. And our ancestors, if you're from those northern peoples where you had to worry about frost, and you couldn't grow plants all year round, there's a different sense of time, because you've got to get that crop in and out or you're going to die, and so is your family. Okay, so that might be part of what makes the difference. My other good buddy up here, Pastor Joel Ramirez, will come and speak to us in a few weeks. I'm hoping someday to learn how to speak Spanish. But every once in a while, I'd hit a point and there would be an idiom or something where I wanted to know how to say something. I couldn't figure out how to say it in English. And I came up to him one day and said, I want to talk about spending time with somebody, spending time. And he thought for a minute and he says, we don't spend time. See, time is something, it's a commodity. It's like money. It's something you've got limited amount of. Other cultures have lots of time. Time is something that's available. If a friend needs help, you go take care of him. Nobody gets upset. You know, that's what you do, because relationships are more important than chronos. Oh, my poor wife gets so nervous at that. This is people have really different ways of looking at how the world works. And that's one of the things you're going to learn working with people of other cultures, is that the way you understand it isn't the way the whole world works. Okay? Other people understand things radically, and they're not wrong. They're different. They've figured out a different system that works for them. I just texted my son. They're talking, something triggered a question. They spent a year in Liberia, went over to do a micro-lending for women project, and then there was in the next country over in Ivory Coast, there was a revolution and a lot of shooting going on, and the dots on the line between Liberia and Ivory Coast are just dots on the ground. They don't even quite know where the border is. But once upon a time, they were all one tribe. And then the French came in with Ivory Coast, and the Americans sent people over to Liberia. And so one side speaks their tribal language plus English, and the other side speaks the tribal language plus French. But they're all still one tribe. And when there's a problem or a famine or something's going on, they just go over the flow of the border and they show up there. Well, all of a sudden, tens of thousands of people are coming across the border. And so then the UN High Commissioner for Refugees came to my son and said, here's $500,000 in cash. Would you please build us a refugee camp? I'm not talking check. I'm talking about a briefcase with $500,000 in cash. Here. I could tell you some interesting stories about that, but that's not the time tonight. Tim noticed that their staff in Monrovia, the capital, every day they stopped at the grocery store and bought 2 cups of rice. Well, after watching this, that they were going to stop and buy 2 cups of rice today or tomorrow, Tim said, wouldn't it be so much cheaper buying a 50-pound bag of rice, and you'd have it right there and you wouldn't have to run to the store every day? And they said, oh, no, you don't understand. If we had a 50-pound bag of rice, then we'd have to share it with everybody in our apartment building and everybody, all of our friends and neighbors, because we had this big chunk of rice. And so it would be our responsibility. Now, there is almost no agriculture in Liberia because there's so much food in the jungle that if they're hungry, they go out and they find a stock of bananas and they bring those into the village, and everybody has bananas that day. And if somebody gets an animal, it's 95 and muggy, and so it's not going to keep. So they all chop it up and share it around, and everybody eats that day, and that's how it works. So when you go to when they were paid on it with a check, got a paycheck one day, the next day they were broke because everybody they knew had some need, and they would lose face, and they would be seen as bad people if they didn't share. Now, when Liberians came over here, we had to work. I was working with a church that had a lot of Liberian people, and the pastor said, I don't know what to do. We've got people in our congregation who've run up a $30,000 credit card bill because people would be incessantly calling them and saying, I really need $10. Can you wire me $10? You're a rich American now, and I need $50. And they couldn't say no because, well, they had a credit card. And so this was, and like, Tim would say, well, people would have a hard time paying for their kids' school. Well, you just save up a little bit. Well, I can't do that because they know how much money I make, and if I've got any money left, then I'm not a good person. So, you have to figure out changing paradigms. You have to figure out values and cultures. You have to, this is so deeply wired. It's like that thing. I can't shut off where I feel comfortable distance-wise from people. I know I do it, and it's stupid. And but it's something I feel inside that I have to open that up a little bit, because it's just, was wired from the time I was a little pumpkin. I don't know. It may have been, had something to do with dental care or something among Scandinavians. But anyway, so, okay. When we're talking about this, the cultural stuff, any quick reactions on that? If not, you're going to get the quiz. You can stall. Okay, those of you who weren't in the class last week, you don't have to take the quiz. Where'd it go? Is that it here? There it is, right there. If you happen to get the one that says key, this should be so easy. We've gone over all of the answers in the last hour, I think. So take this, and this will be our first little quizito here. A special gift just for you. But wait, there's more. No, there's not. Okay, there you go. Sorry. We could have passed these out earlier, but then you'd all had it filled out already, and you'd be bored. Okay, you weren't here, so. Okie dokie. Don't forget to put your name in the upper right-hand corner. My mind reading is just really rusty.